Hey, everybody. Welcome into an all-new episode of Can We Please Talk podcast. As always, I'm Mike Leon.
And I'm Nick Saveri.
On the program today, a week that was here in the U.S., political space, Nick. It feels like we've been off for forever. We haven't. We've only been off for like 5 or 6 days. The current president of the United States addressed the nation to tell them he's not running for re-election. The current vice president of the United States is running for president and is hitting the campaign trail hard. And the former president of the United States is calling for unity, but then trotted out the greatest hits and a new one that Nick and I will explain why words matter. Plus, later on in the program, Libertarian presidential candidate Chase Oliver joins us. He's going to be breaking down not only the Libertarian platform, but his background in politics, what he's done to get here. You may not know about Chase unless maybe you live in Georgia and you know a little bit more about his run for Senate back then. A few years back, Chase is going to explain all of that and the Libertarian platform on the other side of the break. Some housekeeping notes before I say hello to Mr. Saveri. An all-new episode of the Double Jab podcast is out there over on leonmedianetwork.com or wherever you get your podcasts. This week on the show, Rich welcomes in 18-year-old phenom Kaipo Gallegos. I'm so high on this kid. If you follow me on social media, you know that I'm in the boxing space, but Rich welcomes in this kid, undefeated 6-1, talking about his training, his preparation, his family background, some incredible sparring partners that he has gone up against. All new episodes of the Double Jab podcast over on leonmedianetwork.com or listen wherever you get your podcast. Speaking of podcast here on the network, an all new episode of the Educate US podcast is out there over on leonmedianetwork.com or listen wherever you get your pods. This week on the show, a friend of the pod comes back, Nick, as you guys welcome back in Ariel Taylor-Smith, the Senior Director of the National Parents Union Policy and Action Center. Some great stuff talking about some of the impact of some of these policies that we're seeing on our schools, specifically from the conservative lens. You guys talk a little bit about Project 2025, how it could impact education, some education talking points, which we get into with Chase in just a sec, about, giving money back to parents. How does that work? Is it really feasible? Find out an all-new episode of the Educate US podcast over on leonmedianetwork.com or listen wherever you get your pods. All right, now I say hello to my buddy Nick Saveri. Nick, it hasn't been long, but it's been long. Like you and I, we recorded something after Biden, like Michael Jordan faxed in his whole, I'm not coming back. If you're familiar with that reference, Jordan, I believe, did it on a Saturday at like 2 p.m. Biden does it on a Sunday. Crazy week. We're going to get into all of it, but how you doing?
I'm good. I think there's this weird phenomenon of so much has happened. So, the fact that we're doing our show once a week, you go through this whirlwind of, okay, we recorded, but then there's a bunch happening that we text back and forth about like we do with our friends. So you feel like a lot has happened, but not a lot has happened in the sense of like recording and putting out episodes and stuff like that. So that's been steadily taking on. But yeah, no, we're good. We're just kind of plugging away and just enjoying the weather. And, it's summer still for everybody. We've been fortunate. We've seen some drop off in the temperature, but, in some parts of the country, that's not been the case. So we've been fortunate here in PA. But, obviously we're a big spotlight right now because we're down to 3 candidates for the vice presidential nomination. And our governor, Josh Shapiro, keeps coming up as a name. We're seeing more and more clips of Shapiro, presenting himself potentially as a nominee. And selfishly, I hope that doesn't happen. I think that Pennsylvania has worked hard to have moderate Democrats really come to the forefront here. So, potentially losing him would be a pretty sizable loss for the state, for all the inroads he's made. So we're just monitoring that between him and, John Fetterman, and obviously Bob Casey. Obviously his Senate seat is up this year. So we're just sort of feeling all the electoral energy in Pennsylvania at the moment. How about you all?
I'm good. You mentioned the heat. Now, I'm down in the area of the country where it is hot. And so just been traveling up and down the state doing some stuff. If you haven't seen some of the boxing stuff that we do over here at leonmedianetwork.com, go to boxlabpromotions.com. Check out the promotional company that we work in conjunction with some of the team members here at Leon Media Network. Work with they just had a great fight up at the Caribe Royale in Orlando, the hotel. Fight aired worldwide on the Zone in association with MVP, which is part of Jake Paul's outfit. So If you know who Jake Paul is, welcome. If you don't know who Jake Paul is, you know what? Maybe don't go check it out. But yeah, it's just been busy doing all of that work up there on the boxing front, and it's fun to be able to mix a little bit of sports and politics. And one day I will explain to people how boxing and politics are very similar. Very, very, very similar. Everyone in boxing's got a political opinion. Judges they think are corrupt. Where do we hear that judges are corrupt in U.S. politics? So a lot of synergies there between boxing and politics. Let's get into politics as what we do here, Nick, on this show, because I touched a little bit on it in the intro and some of the reads on some of the other shows here across the network. You touched a little bit about the VP candidates. We're going to get into that in a second, and Kamala Harris jumping into the race. The first thing I wanted to do was, our last episode, obviously, we just kind of broke down Joe Biden deciding to step aside. At the time, we hadn't heard from him. He was alive and well. The rumors were out there about that he was dead. He was not dead, folks. Okay. As I've told some people this past weekend, if Joe Biden had been dead, I would have known. And other people would have known because TMZ would have known. Okay. If TMZ gets it, everyone's going to know. So give me a break. All right. I can't entertain things like that, but I'm getting sidetracked for a second. So the president didn't say anything, wrote this, letter that was posted on social media, but then he actually did a speech from the Oval Office. I want to play a little bit of it here, Nick, because I don't know if you watched the speech at all. I actually did not watch the speech, so I actually haven't heard most of this, but I want to play a little bit and react on the other side. So take a listen.
My fellow Americans, I'm speaking to you tonight from behind the resolute desk in the Oval Office. In this sacred space, I'm surrounded by portraits of extraordinary American presidents. Thomas Jefferson wrote the immortal words that guide this nation. George Washington, who showed us presidents are not kings. Abraham Lincoln, who implored us to reject malice. Franklin Roosevelt, who inspired us to reject fear. I revere this office, but I love my country more. It's been the honor of my life to serve as your president. But in the defense of democracy, which is at stake, I think it's more important than any title. I draw strength and I find joy in working for the American people. But this sacred task of perfecting our union is not about me. It's about you, your families, your futures. It's about we, the people. We can never forget that. And I never have. I've made it clear that I believe America is at an inflection point. One of those rare moments in history when the decisions we make now will determine our fate of our nation and the world for decades to come. America's going to have to choose between moving forward or backward, between hope and hate, between unity and division. We have to decide, do we still believe in honesty, decency, respect, freedom, justice, and democracy? In this moment, we can see those we disagree with not as enemies, but as fellow Americans. Can we do that? Does character in public life still matter? I believe I know the answer to these questions because I know you, the American people. And I know this: we are a great nation because we are good people.
So it was my first time hearing that in all seriousness, even though, I help with collecting the clips, but it's the first time I've heard it all the way through. And initial reaction for me, and then I want to turn to you, Nick, because obviously we talked about it last week. And I tend to look at these things a little bit more from this television perspective. What I mean by that is the appearance, right? Everyone talks about perception is reality. And I've always said that makes no sense. Reality is reality. It's not what you perceive. I mean, that's subjective. What it actually is something totally different. As I'm watching that speech and I'm listening to it and I'm watching his body language and I'm watching him a slight mess up there towards the end, I see a person that has diminished over these last couple of weeks since the debate, since June 27th. I'm sure people can pinpoint earlier points and throughout the presidency in 22, 23, as you get older, he has had those type of moments. And sometimes those moments supersede some of the other stuff. And I heard Ali Velshi, MSNBC host, he was on a political podcast I was listening to recently, say something to the effect of President Biden, this campaign and the presidency, the campaign was focusing on kind of what he did before. And it's not about that. A campaign is not about that. A campaign is about going forward. And when you're trying to go forward, you need to show that you can go forward for the next 4 years because you're asking for a job that has, a date attached to it, right? If democracy doesn't end. And so that's the problem. No one can look forward when they're 81 and 4 more years from that would be 85. And they've looked diminished over the last couple of years. So I say all that to say, as I watched that speech right now and just listened to that clip that played, and you and I have the benefit of watching it on video, you can see that Joe Biden's older. Like you can see that this is probably weighed on him. Also, he's getting off of an illness that he just had, right? So he was out for a couple of days out of commission before the speech, obviously, as he was home resting in Delaware. So when you take all of that into account, Nick, that makes it tougher for people to potentially vote for him for 4 more years. It makes it easier for us to all see right now that the decision was super easy to pass the torch to the much younger vice president who's still on the ticket, who can still represent the ticket going forward. So, by the way, this whole notion from Republicans or anybody that Democrats are subverting democracy, no, they're not. Because as I've said to people, if on June 28th, President Biden decided to step aside, not one single person would be saying anything because we all would have watched the night before, like 51 million people had watched on CNN, that he didn't have it. And people were starting to feel bad for him. He didn't know where he was. He was stopping mid-sentence at times. So now he decided after a few weeks and more polling and more people from outside of his internal circle explaining to him that they don't think he can win in November, he decided to step aside. And I think the speech is, look, it's pie in the sky. We're politically divided because, as I've said, some people don't believe in fact fiction. They just believe in what they believe in. And like I tell people all the time, I believe I'm a millionaire. I call my accountant. He tells me I'm not. So that is the difference. So that's cool that you believe that. That's great. If it doesn't jive with the actual facts, then it's not true. And it's not a F your beliefs, F your feelings type of t-shirt that I want printed out there that already you've seen on the different campaign trails. It's not about that. It's just more about living in this area where this is a fact. This is fiction. There's no such thing as my facts, your facts. It's the facts. And Joe's speech there is like, yeah, I believe in you, the American people. Yeah, but Joe, there are some people that just want to watch the world burn, and they know that they're making money off of this stuff, and they don't want to come for us to come together. And we know that. Nick, I turn to you because this is maybe, I don't know if you heard the speech or if you were watching it live, but what'd you make of that couple of minutes there from President Biden's opening remarks?
Yeah, I think it added color to the letter, that we all saw on Sunday, that was posted on social media. I would have appreciated if he would just simply step forward and say, look, I ain't got it. Like, if you're asking me to be president and run for a second term, I can't do both. So I'm more interested in fulfilling the responsibility of the job I have right now. Boom, we're done. That's it. You could have just stopped tape right there and we could have moved it on. So saying all that, I should have just been paid right now for the Biden team for that. But but seriously though, it's just a lot of word salad. I'm a history fan. Obviously, people see the bookshelf, but in this moment, I don't care about George Washington's view about avoiding, being a tyrannical leader by stepping down. I don't care about Abraham Lincoln appealing to the better angels of our nature. I don't care about any other president except the one that's leading my country today. And when that person says, I've decided not to seek a second term, and here's why, and here's who in my place I feel should be running for the Democratic ticket. That's what I want to hear. oftentimes Biden has a tendency to talk about the promise of America and all these platitudes, which I think appeals to an older audience that still likes to believe in the myth of the superiority of the United States. And if you think I'm sounding, somewhat disrespectful, I mean, go look at the GDP, go look at other metrics. We're not the best in the world at very many things these days. But we certainly, have this opportunity to continue a thriving democracy that, as Mike and I will talk about in a moment, at least one person may be trying to legitimately threaten, if he wins the election. But he tends to go on longer than he needed to, and I think that was an opportunity to just be very clear with us, where he stands on all this. So it was just a bit wordy, and I agree with you. I mean, just to read body language, and I heard the speech, I listened. He certainly sounds older. He certainly sounds like he's gathering his thoughts in real time. And contrast that from the moment that the energy was being placed, electoral energy toward Vice President Harris, just the difference in hearing her talk, hearing the way she's presented herself. There's a vibrancy there that we have missed for so long when we've gone from one really just sadly dotty president to another one who just sounds like just the crazy person that you have at the barbecue.
I'll leave the to the historians of where Joe Biden's presidency, and we're going to be having one on in the coming weeks. As always, we always have a bunch of historians that come on this show, but I leave it to them to rank Biden's accomplishments and what the administration has done, failures as well. Obviously, Afghanistan withdrawal top of mind, but I'm with you, and you led perfectly into the next segue, because the energy that you're starting to see is now prevalent in the Democratic Party, because at least from what you're seeing, and I know you and another friend of the show recently were texting me about this Zoom call that Kamala Harris was doing, and this mobilization of women that were starting to come into the potential party. So I wanted to pivot real quick into Vice President Harris. Let's play a little bit in a second of what she just said. But the Harris campaign now, all the infrastructure around the Biden campaign, potentially shifting over to the Harris campaign, and it raised $200 million in the first week. The White House campaign has raised, signed up 170,000 volunteers. This is according to ABC News and other outlets. The bulk of the donations, Nick, and we were talking about this on a previous episode about, some of the small donations and things like that that come from Act Blue and some other ones. 66% of the donations came from first-time contributors in the 2024 election cycle and were made immediately after President Biden announced his exit from the race and endorsed Harris. So those are the two caveats. He stepped aside Sunday. I believe he endorsed Harris the next day. So that's a key wording there in the sentence, because it's 66% first-time contributors. Election is obviously a little bit under 100 days now. The convention's coming up in about 3 weeks. Let's play a little bit. You were talking about the energy. In the first remarks that she said, and I know this has been out there now for a couple of days, but we haven't recorded since, but I wanted to play a little bit of Kamala Harris's speech that she gave a couple of days ago when she was out in Wisconsin. Take a listen.
So as Leah told you, before I was elected vice president, before I was elected United States Senator, I was elected Attorney General of the state of California, and I was a courtroom prosecutor before then. And in those roles, I took on perpetrators of all kinds. Predators who abused women, fraudsters who ripped off consumers, cheaters who broke the rules for their own gain. So hear me when I say, I know Donald Trump's type.
Her campaign said it held 2,300 or so organizing events in battleground states this weekend. This is this past weekend, Nick, as we're recording it right now. So 2,300 or so organized events from the Harris campaign. Also, several high-profile Democrats have already endorsed her. I've mentioned it before with Gavin Newsom and Pete Buttigieg, and obviously President Biden endorsing her as well. Barack Obama has come out and endorsed her. So there's been a lot of momentum so far in the early buildup. We're going to play in a little bit of the former president of the United States and what he's been doing on the campaign trail. But what do you make of first Harris and the momentum swing, a little bit of the speech there, the vice presidential stuff? What do you make of it?
It's funny because I've heard that speech a couple of times, that clip of her experience as a prosecutor and knowing Donald Trump's type. Going out and calling this guy a criminal. Listen, most of us heard the decision in New York, 34 for 34, right? You can get that on a t-shirt if you want. But that sounds a little like what we saw from other prosecutors, particularly I think about Letitia James in New York. And a while ago, you, myself, and I think you may have talked to Ellie Honig separately, friend of the show, CNN legal analyst, about this, where sometimes when a prosecutor seems to show a lot of zeal about going after the defendant, sometimes that can work against you as a form of bias by a jury. And it's not quite that, but it's a little bit. We get it. This person has engaged in criminal activity. But what's really on the minds of a lot of voters, if I were speaking to the vice president right now, are these concerns that are really what they talk about all the time economically. While I tend to shy away from, this idea of a surge of the southern border and this border crisis, because a lot of it tends to traffic in racism, to be honest. It's something that people talk about, especially those who live in like Texas and Arizona and all these border states. Like, this is a real thing. Those are the things that matter. If she's going to make inroads in those voters, there's a lot of them, then you got to tell me more about not the fact that the other guy's a criminal, but what are you going to do? And if you're going to build off of the momentum of what I would consider a pretty successful presidency so far in Joe Biden's, awesome. Tell me about that. But yeah, I'm not a big fan of let's go ahead and demonize the other guy, because the other side does that. I just heard, a clip of Trump's, I think from today or recently, where he makes, he talks about the IQ of Vice President Harris, which is something he does. He particularly loves to downplay women, particularly black women. So I'm not surprised. And if I'm a Trump supporter, that's what I feed off of. My question to the Democrats is, are you good with that too? Do you want to do the same thing? Do you want to get up there and just say this person's a criminal and yada, yada, yada? Or do you want to talk meaningfully about what are we going to do to make sure that gas is at a stable price, to make sure that, we're doing better economically, that our trade relationship with China continues to favor our country, that we don't have tariffs on all products that possibly could bring economic ruin to all Americans. Get into a serious conversation. I'm not here for the jokes, because the other side does it. And that's not, as a Democrat, that's not what I think is going to win us this election. Same thing with these stupid TikTok videos. If I can talk for a moment about, all the energy about the Gen Zers and the millennials who are so happy about she's doing TikTok and look at her doing the dance. Shut up and register, please. Can you do that for me?
Well said there towards the end there. You're a little bit of turbulence there coming in on that landing, but I like the landing. Stuck it there. One thing I did want to mention, and I agree with you. I'm very much in this ethos of stop focusing on the other person and focus on what you are going to do. What is your differentiation between what the previous guy that you're working for right now, who's decided to step aside, what are you going to carry forth from his agenda, and what's different about you? Don't worry about the other guy. The other guy is imploding on his own. The other guy, and again, imploding on his own, meaning he's got his own political mess. I mean, someone tried to shoot at him recently. He's had his own legal troubles. Now he's the old guy in the race. He has his own issues. And we're going to get into another issue that he just said recently this past weekend to some voters as he's trying to garner their votes as to why he's making the argument for potentially ending democracy. But one thing I did want to mention to you, Nick, was, and I thought it was interesting because Kamala Harris, and again, Nick, you and I hate using the term political junkies, but you and I have been following a lot of this. And in 2019, Kamala Harris obviously decided to run for the highest office in the land and threw her name in there. And she had a phenomenal debate performance in June at one of the primary debates, and she shot up in national polls. She was peaking around 15, 16% voter support. And then all of a sudden, 5 months later, she's dropping out of the race after her polling was in the very, very low single digits. So people were like, well, what happened? What was that decline? And so I think it's kind of like it hurts her and it helps her here that the calendar is not that long till November. We've mentioned it already, 100 days till the election. And actually, it's really, as I heard again from the great Ali Velshi, it's really shorter because remember, early voting starts in some states, including in my own state, which early voting starts in October. So you're going to get people that are going to potentially vote for a candidate earlier than most, and they're going to want to hear more about their platform. And I think for Kamala Harris, in that 2019 cycle with Elizabeth Warren, with obviously Bernie Sanders in there, with other candidates that were throwing their hat in the ring, Pete Buttigieg and Joe Biden, obviously coming out of that fray, I think what was starting to happen was people were starting to listen to her a little bit more and maybe didn't like enough of her stances. Maybe she was too hard on crime, which is incredible to hear because of some of the things that she did as attorney general and how we always hear Republicans say that they're the party of law and order. And here's a person that was actually carrying out law and order. And it's like, whoa, that's a little too much law and order. I did want to mention that because I think it's interesting as we watch over these next couple of weeks as she gives speeches and goes out on the campaign trail. If that comes back into play, like if there's, because right now you have to saturate the market. You've got to get out there. Whenever there's a camera on, you've got to do interviews. I would recommend for her to do interviews because a lot of people don't know much about her. And you can kind of create, this long tail effect with respect to all the content that's out there. And obviously, I just mentioned how many campaign events, her team is starting to do over these past week or so. It's only been about 8 or 9 days. We got the convention coming up. That's going to be critical. The VP pick and that person getting out there and doing the media rounds. People need to find out more about, I know you know a lot about Josh Shapiro because he's your governor. I don't know anything about Josh Shapiro other than that he beat Doug Mastriano for governor a few years ago. So I think that's going to be imperative. I want to, before we go to the break, and welcome in somebody who's also running for the highest office in the land, and Chase Oliver from the Libertarian side. I did want to play this last thing, and we've got to give a couple minutes to this because the former president of the United States, obviously, in the wake of the assassination attempts, and maybe in our next episode, we'll cover the Secret Service hearing and the Secret Service director stepping down, because that was a huge deal on Capitol Hill as Republicans and Democrats were attacking this Secret Service director and the infrastructure and what took place in that failure. But these last couple of weeks for him have not been that great. Obviously, an attempt on his life. And then the RNC convention happens, and a speech where he goes on for about an hour rambling about some of the greatest hits as he starts the speech saying we need to unify. But then over the weekend, he gave a speech to a bunch of evangelical organizers, or a group that was out there, part of Turning Point USA, Charlie Kirk's organization. And he kind of uttered something that has a lot of people, including the two hosts of this show, listening very carefully. Take a listen.
Christians, get out and vote just this time. You won't have to do it anymore. 4 more years, you know what? It'll be fixed. It'll be fine. You won't have to vote anymore, my beautiful Christians. I love you, Christians. I'm a Christian. I love you. Get out. You got to get out and vote. In 4 years, you don't have to vote again. We'll have it fixed so good you're not going to have to vote.
All right, listen to me for a second. I mean this in all seriousness. I want to start this a little bit serious because a lot of pundits and a lot of Republican senators, folks that are surrogates for the former president making the rounds on TV were asked about this over the weekend. And they all kind of gave the, classic guy, big old Trump, that's the way he is, Tupac, Bruce Hornsby. That's just the way it is, right? That's just the way he is. That is for somebody like me, whose father left Cuba in 1960 and came here because of a person who was running on a similar message that don't worry about this. In a couple of years, we'll take care of all of this. And then freedom started to get stripped out, and specifically the freedom to express your right to choose a candidate, right? Who it is you want to vote for. That shit is not funny. I don't care about the language. That shit is not funny. So shame on you, Lindsey Graham. Shame on you, New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu. Any other Republican pundits that came out and said, ha ha, same old, same old. because as there's a book over my shoulder, and Nick knows this because we interviewed him recently, David Marchek, who wrote Peaceful Transfer of Power, worked formerly in the Obama administration, told us there's only been, besides the Civil War, there's only been one other time where we did not have a peaceful transfer of power in this country. And we all know the date, and it was in 2021, and it was under the former president. So to say to a group of people, and this is not one of those things where he was giving a speech similar to what he's done recently, and he was like, and I know the media is going to run with that one. Those were jokes. I get that one. This is not a joke. This is not a laughing matter, folks. This is not funny. We need to vote every year. Republican, Democrat, we're going to hear from Libertarian in just a second, Independent, whatever it is. But you need to exercise your right to vote. And for somebody to tell us that in 4 years, don't worry about it, you're not going to have to do this anymore, that should make all of you scared. I'm sorry. It should make all of you scared. And it's why my dad got on a boat to come here in 1960. I want to turn it over to you now, Nick, because I said it before and I'm going to say it again. And for the people that are in the Trump camp, listen to me. Okay, listen to me. Because if he's elected and in 2 years that statement comes true, just remember, I don't want an I told you so. Okay, because we're going to be living through it. I don't want an I told you so then, when you can listen to it now. He said it now. And I always hearken back to 2020 during the COVID pressers when, and I've said this before, you can look this up. It's on YouTube of those pressers that former President Trump used to do that everybody was watching. He said something about a data point. And the next day, Kayleigh McEnerney came up to the podium, the White House press secretary, and they asked her about it. And she said, look, I didn't listen to it. I don't know the context, but I'm sure he was kidding. The next day after that, he's getting on a helicopter, as they always do, asking these questions as the president is outside the helicopter. Drives me nuts. I don't care which president. It's the stupidest thing ever, as reporters are shouting questions as helicopter blades are spinning in the background. And Trump said, and I'm paraphrasing, why are you asking her? I'm the president. I don't kid. I don't kid. Those 3 words. He said, I don't kid. And now I just heard him say that. And Lindsey Graham's telling me he's kidding. Nick, I turn to you.
Yeah, I did hear one other version of this, that maybe this came up, or he said it that way because he knows if he wins his election, he only has 4 more years. No president can serve more than 2 terms. And that's a somewhat sobering thought, and maybe that's what he's alluding to.
Okay,
but even so, and I personally, I always love when you share the experiences of your dad. I'd gladly have him on this show to talk more about this, because I think, you and I talk often about when people complain about this country and they talk about democracy and, all this complaining. And then you rightfully, like I do, say, get on a plane and go visit a whole slew of other countries that wish they had this kind of opportunity as you do to freely vote. In any other country, if you had a foreign leader say something like that to their people, running for office, and threaten that in a few years you won't have to do this anymore, that nation and that leader would have a file immediately created. We can ask Marie Harf this question. The CIA would immediately have a file on that person, and immediately the intelligence field would be monitoring the situation there. Because what you're talking about essentially is a military base takeover. As someone who is the child of 2 Indian parents, our relations with Pakistan have never been great. For many years, Pakistan had a situation where you have military leadership. That was the only way to have any form of stable government. Iran, a couple years back had their elections, and we were the world closely monitored, because how legitimate are those elections? Vladimir Putin won his re-election not too long ago. But of course, like we all did, we all paid attention to see, is this legitimate? Like, does it really matter if people vote, or is he just going to win this anyway? So anytime in this country, especially when someone makes any type of allusion to, well, we don't have to have this voting thing anymore, that should wake people up. That should immediately be something that calls attention to a very scary reality.
We leave it there. When we come back after the break, Libertarian presidential candidate Chase Oliver joins us. Going to find out more about his platform. I encourage people, like I mentioned at the beginning of the segment, go Google Chase Oliver. Go to votechaseoliver.com, because if you go to the main sites, you won't find anything about Chase Oliver. And we're going to get into some of that, about the access, the media access. Chase on the other side of the break. Quick break from the pod, as always, to tell you about our friends over at Fresh Roasted Coffee. Delicious tasting coffee that fuels me and Nick every episode. And now it's the summer months. It's hot out, iced coffee, cold brew, tea, iced tea specifically. Got to have all these drinks in these summer months. Nick, you a cold brew guy over there?
Yeah, absolutely. The second that the weather gets hot, my coffee gets cold. Damn, that was a nice line, actually.
That's all
but
right.
yeah, I just recently tried the cold brew. I was super excited about it. I definitely drink a lot of iced coffees and cold brews from different places. I order everything from Fresh Roasted Coffee, so the fact I can now get my cold brew as well from there, I'm totally in.
I knew you would be. And for the people out there that are listening, as always, thanks for supporting Fresh Roasted Coffee, because the blends, the flavors, the roast, you can go to their website by clicking the link in our show notes right now. Put in some cold brew into the shopping cart. When you get to checkout, enter in the promo code, can we please get 20, all one word, can we please get 2020. You're going to get 20% off that first purchase. All right, kind enough to give us some time here, Libertarian presidential candidate Chase Oliver. Chase, Mike, and Nick, thank you so much for hopping on the program with us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
You know, Chase, we were talking off air that, we had met a while back at the free and equal elections debate that happened back in February. You did a great job at the one that just happened this past July in Las Vegas. We're going to get into a little bit of that in just a second, because there was a candidate that gave a speech before the debate but didn't join the debate. I want to get into that in just a bit. But first, for our audience that maybe is not familiar with you, obviously Nick and I are familiar with you. They may not know anything about how you ran in Georgia for senator. Tell us a little bit more about Chase Oliver's journey so far in American politics and why you are running for president.
Yeah, so really my beginning in politics starts with being an activist. I started out being an anti-war activist right out of high school because I opposed the Bush wars. But from there, I, was nominally a Democrat until 2008 when we elected Barack Obama. And then he kind of walked back all the anti-war promises he made. So even though he won the Nobel Peace Prize, I felt compelled to leave the Democratic Party. I discovered the Libertarian Party for the first time in 2010 when I was at the Atlanta Pride Festival. The Libertarian Party of Georgia was there, campaigning with their candidate for governor and others. And that was my first Libertarian vote. And then I, as an independent over the next few years, I still voted Libertarian until 2014 when I became one full-fledged party member. And then I've gotten to run a few times. I ran in 2020 for U.S. House in the 5th District in Atlanta because John Lewis had passed away and there was a special election to replace him. And then in 2022, I ran for the U.S. Senate in Georgia as the Libertarian candidate, running against Herschel Walker and Raphael Warnock. I initiated the runoff in that race by earning 2.1% of the vote. And now I am the Libertarian candidate for President of the United States after having campaigned across all 50 states, campaigning to as many people as possible. And I think it was that energy and drive that ultimately won me the nomination after 7 rounds of voting well into the night and into the next morning. It was 1 a.m. on Monday during the weekend of our convention when I won the nomination.
Chase, on this platform, if you don't mind just taking us through, because obviously we all know the news from Sunday, new Democratic nominee. That process is about to hit a reset button. We obviously know who the Republicans are running with, and their respective platforms are pretty, readily available now. But for libertarians, just nationally, where do you all stand on the major issues? What essentially would make up the libertarian platform?
Well, I think if you look at our platform and our principles, much of it is rooted in the idea of non-aggression and the fact that we think that the government should not be doing anything that's beyond protecting the liberties and the civil liberties of one another. And so much of what government does we find to be either redundant or unneeded or expensive. And better suited in the private marketplace. And so with the largest issue this is the day, I would say the largest issue being inflation. We want to get spending under control. And certainly we believe that the trillions of dollars in debt we run up each year is the primary driver of inflation. And so we believe that we should at least balance the budget and continue to cut spending until we can continue to cut taxes and get government down to as small as a government as possible. So really, when you look at to what is the libertarian solution, usually it says, can the free market do this better than government? Is this an essential function of government? And if both of those questions, if the answer to the first question is yes, and the second question is no, we believe the government shouldn't be doing it.
Chase, you fed into the follow-up perfectly because, Nick was mentioning about the libertarian platform. I want to get into some of the issues specifically because, we've done some voter focus groups here, and obviously you've been traveling the country, like you mentioned, trying to garner support and gain people's votes. So I'm sure you've heard a lot of the same things about where do you stand on your economic policy? The price of consumer goods are higher year over year. Where do you stand on immigration? And what is the true crisis at the border? So we're going to get into a bunch of it in a second, but I did want to play for you first a clip from the debate that happened a couple of weeks ago at Freedom Fest in Las Vegas, because you said something that I thought was really interesting on the stage when you were asked by Representative Thomas Massey, who co-moderated the debate with Christina Tobin, who's the founder of Free and Equal Elections Foundation. You got asked a question about economic policy, and you kind of tied it into Social Security. So take a listen to this.
Get government out of the way of innovation. That's what will boost our economy. Reduce the debt, reduce the deficits, and you have to do that by cutting spending. You can't just cut taxes, because when you cut taxes, you create debts and deficits which drive up inflation and is a hidden tax on every single American. So not only do we have to cut taxes, which I would love, but we have to cut spending, and you do that by being brave enough to grab the third rail of American politics, Social Security and entitlements. We have to get these under control or remove them entirely. Why? Because my generation right now, I'm paying every paycheck I get into a Social Security program that will be completely bankrupt by the time I'm retired and need to retire. It's a better idea to sundown that program to allow individuals to save for themselves and to actually have a real retirement.
All right. So, Chase, first, I want you to explain a little bit more in depth, because obviously in a debate answer, you're only getting 2 minutes to respond. And then either Jill Stein or Randall was answering back afterwards, or they pivoted to another question. But after you explain a little bit more of that in depth, one of the things that, you hear from older voters, and I can just tell you hearing from my dad, is don't come from my Social Security. And here's Chase Oliver saying, no, we've got to sundown these programs. So can you explain a little bit more of what you were trying to explain in that answer about touching the third rail of American politics? Why is it the third rail of American politics in your estimation?
Well, for the very reason you just described, that people feel like they can't talk about it or mess with it at all for fear of losing votes. And of course, my Social Security plan actually leaves Social Security in place for those who are already retired or near retirement because, they've paid into that system their entire lives. They've been expecting it. But younger workers like myself who are around the age of 40, we know that even if we're paying into this system, it's insolvent, where it's not going to exist by the time we retire. And so we're going to be looking for better options. And I think the better option is to allow the employee contribution to come back to us as workers, and so we can, invest that into our own savings for retirement. And you leave the employer contribution going into paying into the system long enough to keep it solvent for that last generation to retire. And this is being realistic. This is recognizing both that we don't want to take Social Security away from those who live on a fixed income, like my parents, like millions of people's parents and grandparents. But also that we want to be able to save for ourselves and have more economic security outside of a broken Social Security system that is insolvent. But I do think it's the third rail because so many people are afraid to take it head on. Even talking about things like raising the retirement age has people up in arms and, with their pitchforks and torches. But for younger folks like myself, we're just recognizing the economic reality of we're not going to have it. So why are we paying into it?
Chase, in the past, and I talked about obviously Sunday's massive change with Biden's announcement, and about a week before that, we saw an assassination attempt of the former president. It brings back the conversation of guns, which has been part of the public discourse for many years now, especially since the mass shooting at Columbine in 1999. Where do libertarians fall in this conversation? Because there's obviously the space of the role of government in terms of having some kind of potential more sound gun policy. And then obviously staunch Second Amendment activists who want no restriction at all. Where do you live with that?
Yeah, we're far more on the latter side of that conversation. We do believe shall not be infringed. And as the Libertarian Party, we do support your right to defend yourself. We do support the right of gun ownership. And we do believe that if the government can own a gun, you can own a gun. So we've been very much on the side of supporting and defending the Second Amendment. I think the bigger conversation we need to have around mass violence, certainly since 1999, is what has caused the change in our society that has had mass shootings being more prevalent, even as crime rates have gone down and violent crime rates at that. I think the two big factors that we see, one is the rise of social media where people can hide behind a screen and a keyboard and dehumanize others, say sorts of things that you would never say in actual conversation with people for fear of honestly getting a knuckle sandwich, right? Like if you said some of the things people say online, you would be removed from a conversation politely. At best. Now, I think the other thing we have to look at is the rise in use of drugs to treat mental health issues that could be better, handled, not using psychotropic drugs, but talk therapy, using tools like psilocybin therapy, MDMA therapy, ketamine therapies that are far better at treating trauma, PTSD, anxiety, depression, some of these contributing factors that so many of our shooters in these situations have. I think those are the two conversations that really can better move us in a direction as opposed to who can, and banning guns, creating registries, these sorts of things that might deny people their Second Amendment rights. Because we've always had guns. My mom loves to tell me that she had a rifling team at her high school. So kids came to school with bagged rifles that they threw in their locker and they went and shot after school. And yet there was never a school shooting, even though there were a dozen rifles available at the school at any one time. That just tells me that it's a change in culture, not a change in the fact that guns have been prevalent, because they always have been.
Chase, I appreciate that answer. One of the things I've appreciated about you is just hearing you not only at these debates, seeing you obviously in the Senate runoff where I first got, introduced to you, obviously besides meeting you, but it's the way you're answering some of these questions about policy, vision, and strategy. I think anybody who truly lives in a center lane where they think that there's a third option out there, if they listen to you, I think you'd be getting a lot more notice. So in that vein, I want to stay a little bit more on drilling into something policy wise, because, and I'm sure you've maybe heard this, you could tell us if you have or haven't on the campaign trail, has been about immigration. And if you can't notice by Nick and I's face, we're sons of immigrants, right? So this is very important to us. But the thing that I've been very vocal about as I've been making media rounds and things like that, and on this show specifically, is the crisis at the border is a largely administrative one. If you go to the DMV and 1,000 people are waiting online, but there's only 3 people working there, there's going to be a backlog. And that's what we're seeing with the immigration courts. That's what we're seeing with these asylum trials. And not only that, the agency in charge of all of this is telling you they need help. They're underwater, they're undermanned, and they're under-resourced. And I know the libertarian platform is we've got to remove a little bit more of the governmental control on all of this. So where do you stand issues-wise, specifically around immigration? No administration has been able to solve it in 30-something years. How do we can we solve the issue of immigration at the U.S. southern border?
Yeah, I think we can. I think it first starts with acknowledging exactly what you just said, that it's not a crisis created by immigrants wanting to come here and work and live. It's a crisis created by our government's inability to properly process these people and create legal status for people who want to come here and work and contribute to the economy. I call for a 21st century Ellis Island. You mentioned that you and Nick are both children of, or that you're children of immigrants. That's where 4 in 10 people can identify their heritage through Ellis Island, the last great wave of migration that we had in this country that built up businesses, that built up culture, that built up neighborhoods, that built up communities all over this country and helped make part of the patchwork quilt that is America. And I want to continue that tradition by streamlining the immigration process. I think if you want to come here and work, you should be able to come through a port of entry, declare who you are, do a quick background check that can vet for you, do a health check that can make sure you're all good to go, and then come into the United States and work and contribute. That doesn't automatically give you citizenship, obviously, though we should streamline that process, frankly, as well, and certainly give legal status to dreamers, people who were brought here as children through no fault of their own, through their parents bringing them. They need to have legal status, obviously. But if we can streamline this process, we do several things. One, we remove the backlog at our southern border that has so many people staying at the southern border as they wait for their asylum claim or other things. We can just remove that backlog immediately. Secondly, we remove immigrants from the shadow economy, so their labor is no longer being exploited and wages being driven down, not just for them, but also American workers who are competing with them. You're actually competing in a free and open market where people have legal status and they're not having to settle for less because of fear of deportation or being reported. You also make communities safer because in an immigrant community right now, if you fear deportation, you're not likely to go report the crime that you just saw to the police because you don't want your name to be put on the police report. You don't want to have to be asked those questions about where you came from or why you have an accent. And so many people in immigrant communities just don't report these things, and that actually makes our neighborhoods less safe. And so actually streamlining the process, creating a legal status for people who want to come here and work and contribute will make our community safer. It's better for immigrants. It's better for the American worker. Oh, and by the way, it allows us to laser focus our law enforcement at the border on those who are seeking to human traffic for the purposes of labor or sexual exploitation, or those who want to fraud people by putting fentanyl and pressing them into, say, a Xanax tablet and falsely selling that on the black market and poisoning people and causing overdoses. These are the crimes that you actually want to prosecute at our southern border, not peaceful people just wanting to come here to work, but crimes of fraud, crimes of trafficking, crimes of coercion. These are the things that really need to be addressed, and they can be better properly addressed when we laser focus ourselves and allow peaceful people to just do what they're going to do, which is contribute to their American dream.
Chase, you were talking earlier about cutting government spending. One thing that Republicans talk about is education spending, particularly in the form of the Department of Education. And, we've looked at platforms such as Project 2025, and more Republicans talk about the need to reduce that education spending at the federal level. Consequently, obviously, at the state level, there are sometimes gaps of what you're trying to provide students in the form of Title I, Title II based services, obviously Pell Grants and other opportunities for higher education. Where do you all stand on the government's role, or at least from a financial standpoint, in the education of kids?
Oh, yeah. Well, from the federal level, we do want to eliminate the Department of Education. We do want to eliminate the federal spending on education, return that money back to the states. And ultimately, I'm a supporter of the free market of education. So what I would like to see is in states adopting if we're going to have taxation funding this stuff, fund the student, not the system. Fund the individual student, allocate that money to a student to go to whatever school they want to go to, whether that's whether that is a religious, parochial, private, charter. You can continue to go to the public school you're continuing to go to, or even being homeschooled. This allows for more freedom in education, and this allows for educational entrepreneurs to find spaces that do need the gaps to be filled in, where there's real crises going on. If you go to a great public school and you're funding the student, not the system, that school is going to likely keep being funded because they already have the building, the infrastructure, the school bus routes, everything that's already needed. But if you're in a community with a failing public school like Atlanta, where I live, where the Atlanta public schools are so bad that the teachers and administrators got busted on RICO charges for colluding to cheat on test scores to get more funding. Well, you might want more opportunities in your area and in your community. And in those spaces, new schools will pop up. And this also actually is not just better for, I think, parents and students to be able to decide the best school that tailor fits to them, their needs, their individual strengths and skills, particularly when it comes to like high school age students, maybe going to an engineering school or a technical school or a performing arts school or whatever school that might be tailored fit to them. But also is great for teachers who, so many of them come into the industry wanting to be a great teacher that helps to create critical thinkers, lifelong learners. And then they get into a public school system and they see how busted the curriculum is and they get frustrated. And this is why we have so many teachers who leave the industry, because they just feel like the school system itself is not helping them achieve what they want to help achieve for their students. And so I'm a full educational free marketer because I see the potential there, particularly in communities of great need that have really bad schools.
Chase, at the beginning of this, we kind of started talking a little bit about the wars that are happening in Israel and Ukraine when you were kind of briefly touching on foreign policy. So I would love for you to dive into this, specifically if you're commander in chief, of the U.S. military right now. Obviously, we're not involved militarily with ground troops in either of these conflicts, but we're involved in terms of how much aid we're giving to Ukraine and to Israel. But then we're also involved in giving aid to the places that are being blown up, right? Where innocent civilians are dying. So both conflicts, if you can, give us a little bit more of what Chase Oliver's platform and policies would be about handling foreign conflicts like this.
Well, as I said, I got my start being an anti-war activist, and I continue to want to end the militarism of the United States and our military footprint overseas. If I could, I want to start the process of removing ourselves from every foreign military base and returning the United States military back to its actual mission, which is to protect us from sovereign invasion, not to be the world's police, which we can do with a massively reduced Pentagon budget and still be more readily available and able to protect ourselves than any other nation on earth. And so with regards to both of these theaters of war, I would like to end the aid process. I think with regards to Ukraine, if Europe wants to take the lead helping to arm Ukraine, I think they should do that as we pull ourselves out of being in charge of the European theater. I do believe that the EU should be really in charge of Europe, not the United States guiding their policy. And so I think the best thing we can do in Ukraine is both allow refugees to leave Ukraine who are being bombed right now, who want to leave the theater of war and come settle somewhere peacefully until the war is over. We should allow for those refugees to come here, as well as allow for amnesty for any person who's being conscripted in the military. I say that mostly because much of Russia's military right now who's invading Ukraine are conscripts, many of whom who don't want to be there. And so if we can allow them to go AWOL and arrive at amnesty, we're going to demoralize the front lines of the Russian military and hopefully have them pushing back and suing for peace more quickly without firing a single shot. With regards to Israel and Gaza, October 7th was horrible, and I think what we saw, and if we had saw it in our own neighborhoods, we'd be demanding some sort of response. But I think it's the nature of Israel's response, which has killed tens of thousands of innocent Gazans, completely destroyed the infrastructure of Gaza to where it's going to take billions of dollars of reconstruction to even come to some sort of semblance of a normal life there, as if they weren't already in desperate need before October 7th, as if there wasn't already great misery in that area of the world. And so what I would like to see is a ceasefire. I would like to see the release of the hostages, obviously. But I think what we need to see is both the Israelis and the Palestinians demanding better from their governments and demanding that both sides come to peace. They are both being horribly represented in Gaza by Hamas and in Israel by the Netanyahu government, which continue to push for more strife, more division, more war. And I think the worst of that is that you're seeing civilians being harmed by that process. And we need to be a voice for peace. And we need to disengage militarily from both of these conflicts, as well as just generally disengaging from the Middle East and our drone policy and much of what we do around the world.
Chase, and you've been gracious to grace us here with your time. I truly appreciate it. And you explaining not only the Libertarian platform, but where you stand on some of these issues. I did want to ask you before we let you go, is something as I was watching the Libertarian Convention this past year that happened in Washington, D.C., the elephant in the room, right? The former president of the United States, Donald Trump, made an appearance and spoke at this convention. And obviously you can go into a little bit of detail of what you make of him coming to the convention and kind of seeking the votes of libertarians, to maybe get him over the finish line come November. But I'm interested just for your perspective, and I've been very vocal about this, as has Nick. Before we started the primary process back in January, 64% of Americans said they didn't want to see a rematch between these two folks. And obviously there's always been, you have a great video that's on your website about the third party candidate and the rise of a third party candidate. And when can somebody actually break through? You probably get asked this all the time. And I want to put it in realistic terms, because if there were ever a time in American politics where we've seen this kind of supported by data, where it is showing now that people are looking for a third candidate, a viable option. They're punting, they're pushing, matriculating it till November to make that final decision. You've heard these terms like, I'm just going to hold my nose and vote for, and that's not the way American politics should be when you're voting for the president of the United States. So a two-parter here. First, the former president of the Libertarian Convention, what'd you make of all that? Is he just placating, or was he trying to actually make some good points? I think you're going to lean to the former. And then the second part was really more about, how do you guys actually break through on this national stage? Obviously access and obviously media availability and things like that. But how does a true third party candidate rise through and finally make a dent in American politics?
Yeah. So your first question, Donald Trump coming to our convention, I think he probably gave the shortest speech he's ever given at a rally. It was the most uncomfortable audience he's ever been in front of since running for president. Because he came in thinking he was going to have a very friendly audience because he was invited. But what he got was an audience who was ready for him to answer to a lot of the unlibertarian things he did while he was president. He gave a speech. There were a couple moments where we did applaud. That was when he promised to free Ross Ulbricht if he was elected. I think as much as I don't want Donald Trump elected, if he were and actually did that, that would be one good thing he's ever done, so to speak. But really, it was him trying to come in the room and explain why we don't need a third party, why we should just settle for the lesser of two evils. And we've been told that for 50 years. It's not really broken through to libertarians. I don't know why he thought it was going to break through this time. But yeah, so he was most welcome to come and be loudly booed for his policies because he basically just gave the normal Donald Trump speech. Now, as far as how do we grow the Libertarian Party, I think it starts with continuing to run energetic campaigns across the country to win things like ballot access and major party status through our elections. There are several states that are dependent upon my ticket for earning ballot access in future elections in states, or earning major party status that gives us access to things like the primary ballot, debate inclusion, increased media attention. All of these things are the building blocks to help build your party up foundationally. And I think the most important thing is that we fight to change the way we vote. Ranked choice voting or approval voting or any advanced voting model beyond plurality voting will allow for voters to pick their favorite choice without worrying about it, quote unquote, spoiling and allowing for another candidate to win. And so I think if we can change the way we vote, much like Maine and Alaska have adopted ranked choice voting, I think if we can adopt that in more states, you're going to finally see more representative elections and more civil elections. But absent that, I encourage people to continue to vote outside of the two-party system and make their voice be heard. And even if we don't have ranked choice voting, continue to try to build up your local Libertarian Party, try to vote in nonpartisan elections, vote Libertarians into office, so we can actually have proof of concept what happens in local communities when we elect limited government advocates and liberty advocates at the local level. So I'm looking forward to doing that work as a presidential candidate as much as possible.
All politics are local, they say. You can find out more information about Chase and his campaign at votechaseoliver.com. Go check out the free and equal elections debate that happened at Freedom Fest this past July 12th that Chase was a part of. Chase, I can't thank you enough for hopping on the program. Continued success to you, sir, and please stay safe.
Hey, you guys have a wonderful day.
All right, our thank yous again to Chase Oliver, Libertarian presidential candidate. You want to find out more about Chase, go to votechaseoliver.com. Nick, one of the things I like about Chase, you and I have been talking about this before with him as we wrap here and put a bow on this episode. We've been talking about in the first segment, the presidential candidates from the bigger parties. Now we're talking about, we just had a presidential candidate on from the Libertarian Party. And I encourage people to do the same exercise. Type in latest polling into your Google search bar right now of all U.S. presidential candidates 2024. Type it in. Let me know what you see. Because what you are going to see is how Kamala Harris, Donald Trump are faring, maybe even RFK. You see no mention of Chase Oliver's name. And I'm not talking about whether or not you should vote for these people. I'm talking about the fact that you should know that these people exist, that these people are running for the highest office in the land, that these people are out there on the campaign trails. Chase was mentioning it as we were talking to him at the beginning about how he got introduced into politics and him running for, the Senate seat in Georgia, which caused the runoff. He got 2.1% down there in Georgia and it caused the runoff between Warnock and Herschel Walker. And I encourage people to go watch the debate. He did the debate against Raphael Warnock, and Herschel Walker didn't show up. And in the video, in the comment section, people are like, Warnock's pretending like there isn't another candidate on the stage. And I think that's part of the problem that we have here. Like the access, the legitimacy, like taking a third-party candidate serious. We're seeing more states moving towards higher rise in independent registered voters. New Hampshire's a perfect example. Arizona's close to being mostly independent voters, or at least taking over as the majority party in that state. So, Nick, as we put a bow on all of this that we've been talking about with all the candidates, and we just had one running for president on the last segment, what do you make of not only Chase's platform, some of his positions, but what I just said about access? Like if I didn't introduce you to the free and equal elections debates, you may not have even heard about Chase Oliver.
It's a fair point. Something we talked about on in the conversation though was, about the ability to build momentum, not the presidential level. I think that's swinging for a home run. But it's at the ground level. You're trying to see local elections where you're having someone who runs as an independent or a third party, anyone who doesn't, put an R or D next to their name. And how do they do? There's some work to be done with understanding at the most local level, be it your sheriff, the librarian at your library. I don't care. But where's the presence of that third voice? And right now, we've seen this in Congress. We've seen members of the Senate and the House that will declare themselves as an independent. Joe Lieberman's a good example of this. We've seen, Bernie Sanders, is now listed as a, actually, no, Sanders, I think, is still running as a Democrat. But like, you've seen Democrat socialists, you've seen people that kind of like lean to a fringe. And I think that's where the opportunity is. I have sympathy on a certain level for the lack of access, but what I would also offer is it's not practical in where we are as a democracy, or at least our body politic, to assume that a third party is going to come rushing in and really be able to build that kind of momentum. We saw this in 1992 with Ross Perot. In the end, Perot takes about 18% of the popular vote. That's astonishing. But no electoral votes. And even if this was just a popular election, he's still not going to win. So there's a space for that type of energy, but there's got to be more of a long-term plan, I think. And Chase spoke to it again. He ran for Senate. He's been running for the House. So he's trying to do that while also swinging for a home run.
Yeah, you're right. And if you look back at that 92 election, Ross Perot, I think in California, I think he got like 20% of the vote or something like that. So for sure, I encourage people, though, go learn more about votechaseoliver.com. Learn more about other candidates, like get more informed and educated about who exists in the ecosystem. And to Nick's point, not at the highest of high levels, but also at the state and local level. So we leave it there. Our thank yous again to Chase Oliver. If you want to watch the video portion of the interview we did with Chase or any of the other guests that have appeared on the program, head over to our YouTube channel, type in Can We Please Talk Podcast. We should pop right up. Do me a favor, hit the subscribe button while you're there. Audio podcast platforms you know by now, Apple, Spotify, Google. Shout out to everybody who listens to us over on Good Pods. Shout out to Acast, our hosting platform. We can't do it without them. And we can't do it without each and every one of you that listens to this program. As always, I'm Mike Leon.
And I'm Nick Saveri.
We'll see everybody next time.